Oh, thanks a lot, and good morning to everyone. I'll say a couple of words in English and then I'll switch to Finnish and back to English again, and then we'll do some questions. I guess the first point to make is that I'm very appreciative to the Munich Security Council conference for having been invited here. I was invited here as a professor, and all of the meetings that I've had here so far have been very informal. It's been an intense 3 days. It's nice to be back in this capacity. I don't remember how many times I've been here in Munich before, and I'm really looking forward to being a panelist in the last panel, which is supposed to look at what the Munich Security Conference looks like in 60 years. So it's been a good ride. But I really do want to stress the fact that I'm not here speaking for the Finnish government. We only have one president at a time, and that is Sauli Niinistö. I'm a president-elect and will be inaugurated on the 1st of March. Eli kiitos kaikille, että olette tulleet tänne paikalle, ja haluan korostaa sitä, että olen ollut täällä epävirallisessa kapasiteetissa professorina ja on ollut tukku erilaisia mielenkiintoisia keskusteluja sekä palaverin muodossa että sitten käytäväkeskusteluissa. Mukava olla täällä takas. On ollut täällä aika monta kertaa vuosien varrella, ja tämä on minun mielestä yksi maailman parhaista, erityisesti turvallisuuspolitiikkaan liittyvistä konferensseista. So I've had the honor of making interventions in 3 events. The 4th one will come this afternoon. The first one was the inaugural luncheon, which was hosted by Christoph Heusgen, who obviously runs the Munich Security Conference. There I was speaking with the Foreign Minister of India, Mr. Jaishankar, and the Foreign Minister of Poland, Mr. Sikorski, who were foreign ministers with actually in the good old days. I spoke there about the world order and the structures that we're looking at right now. But I think for me personally, the most significant thing there was that was a moment when I heard of the murder and the death of Navalny. It's one of those moments you'll never forget in your life. I would like to send my personal condolences to his family and friends. And as has been noted by so many other world leaders, Russia will and shall be held responsible for yet another atrocious political murder. I also had the opportunity to speak at a World Economic Forum event hosted by Börge Brenden, where there were a number of speakers, including the Foreign Minister of India, again, and myself, and my focus was very much on the situation in Russia and the war in Ukraine. And the same was at an event hosted by the European Council for Foreign Relations. There the theme was also very much along the lines of Ukraine and Russia. And as I said, I'll be speaking at a main event, panel event, I think starting today at 12 o'clock on the next 60 years of the Munich Security Conference and the world order. Sitten tapaamiset, meetings. I've had, I don't remember how many specific meetings, but I'd like to raise 3. Eli nostaisin 3 esille. I had a meeting yesterday with President Zelensky, invited by him. You can ask questions about that meeting if you so desire, but I reiterated Finland's steadfast support to Ukraine, both political, military and financial, and felt quite privileged to have been invited to Kiev, and we'll be looking for dates for a first visit there. I also met my good old friend Jonas Gahr Støre, the Prime Minister of Norway. We're foreign ministers at the same time, and we discussed the synergy between Norway and Finland in the alliance, and also the training exercise that NATO will be conducting in Norway from the 3rd to the 14th of March. And finally, out of the many meetings, I'll just raise one meeting that I had this morning, one-on-one with Jens Stoltenberg, the Secretary General of NATO, and we had an opportunity to discuss a broad range of issues related to Ukraine, related to Finnish NATO membership, relating to commitments that have been outlined by our defense minister, and also then related to the Washington summit in July. On myös tavannut joko marginaaleissa tai muutoin muun muassa hyvän ystäväni Hillary Clintonin, Ursula von der Leyenin, David Cameronin, Kaja Kallaksen ja Mark Ruten, vaan mainitakseni muutaman tässä matkan varrella, että on ollut oikeastaan aika hienoa saada tehdä eräänlainen paluu ja tavata sitten kollegoja tässä matkan varrella. I'll finish off with just briefly the sort of general takeaways that I have from here, or the feelings. I think there's been sort of a mix of pessimism and optimism. Pessimism obviously coming from the two ongoing main wars that we're facing right now, Russian aggression and war in Ukraine, and then of course the war in Gaza. But the optimist in me says that the discussions that I've had have been very result-oriented. So a lot of people are talking about different pathways towards peace. With Zelensky, for instance, we were discussing the possible and also publicly announced peace meeting, which will be hosted by Switzerland in the near future, and what that could entail. And I think also issues linked to Gaza, there's been a lot of constructive suggestions and analysis of what's taking place at the moment. So very sort of result oriented. And I think the sort of three key themes that keep on popping up in the discussions here, one is Ukraine, second one is the Middle East, and the third one, of course, are the US elections. A lot of people have also asked me about the dynamics of the Finnish elections, because many were surprised that in a modern liberal democracy you can conduct a campaign without slander, a campaign where all candidates respect each other, a campaign where we can have civilized conversations about difficult foreign policy issues. All I want to say, especially to the international audience, is that for us foreign security policy is existential. That means that we don't fool around with it. And once history hinges, Finns are very united, very consensus-based. And that's why it's quite easy to have a conversation about our role in NATO, our situation by the border, Russia's attack on Ukraine, the Middle East, or the US elections. So I felt very comfortable where we were in the campaign during the 6 months, and I think it was one of those unifying factors for the whole country, because liberal democracy at times can be a little bit on the rough side. But for us, presidential elections, where the president is, of course, the head of state, but tasked with three main things, one being foreign policy, the second one being the commander-in-chief, and the third one having some kind of a role in portraying and expressing values. I think that was quite well reflected in the debate. So I'll just finish off by saying that I think the 2-3 days that I've been here have been very useful. I think the timing was quite good. Of course, I had nothing to do with it. We had our elections when we did, and the Munich Security Conference is pretty much set in stone for the coming 60 years. So it was good to come here and have a lot of informal get-togethers. And I really would also like to thank Germany for hosting this event. As I said in the beginning, I do think it's one of the best security political conferences around the world. And this is not anymore only about transatlantic relations, and we can see that in the diversity of people here. So here we go.
Sabine Sifus-Arnaud, French journalist from Challenge in Paris. I have 3 quick questions.
Okay.
You mentioned something about von der Leyen, Cameron, and Rutte in Finnish, so I'm sorry, I didn't get it. Well, how do you explain, it's a follow-up of your remark on the Finnish campaign. How do you explain that the true Finns didn't do better, were in the second round? And when do you expect to make a press conference with Macron at the Elysée and possibly in French? And what will be in the heart of the Finnish-French relationship?
Okay, I'll take them one at a time. On Ursula von der Leyen and on David Cameron and Mark Rutte, I just noted that I'd met them in the corridors, and actually David Cameron bilaterally. All three actually are good friends of mine from over the years, and of course with Ursula von der Leyen we talked about European defense and what Europe can do in this very difficult situation. With David Cameron we discussed bilateral UK-Finnish relations and also our close partnership in NATO in the form of Jeff and then possible visits. May I add that I also had a meeting with Keir Starmer and David Lammy from the opposition side. And of course with Mark Rutte we were partially nostalgic about the past and talking a little bit about the future, and as you will know, he's in the running to become NATO Secretary General, and I personally wish him the best of luck in that endeavor. I also followed with interest the conversation that took place yesterday on the main stage between Jonas Gahr Støre, Mark Rutte and Ursula von der Leyen. There you saw, I think, three committed Europeans and transatlanticists in dialogue. True Finns. So Jussi Halla-aho, the Speaker of the House, ran, I think, a very good campaign, and the result for him and his party in presidential elections was historic. He got 90% of the popular vote, which is massive. It is actually pretty much what the opinion polls give the True Finns at the moment, but in the presidential elections for the True Finns it was an exceptional result. I would say that the reasons for that is that his foreign policy analysis is very sharp. His views on NATO have been steadfast in favor. His comprehension analysis of the situation in Ukraine is deep because he actually speaks the language. And we could see that in the debates and discussions that we had throughout the campaign. So I think the result, and he would probably agree and has said it publicly as well, was quite good. But there are only two candidates that go to the second round, and they ended up being myself and Pekka Haavisto, whom I have a lot of respect for. Bon, en ce qui concerne...
it's not symbolic of what could happen on the European elections, actually.
No, well, I mean, you know, it's obviously I'll be following the European elections very closely, and I think they are always one of the most important elections at any given time. And remember that it's the only supranational parliament with real legislative power. So I'll be following that carefully, and it does matter what kind of coalitions merge there. I mean, I became a member of the European Parliament in 2004. Then it was very much about a grand coalition, basically, between the EPP and the Socialists. Now it's much more complicated than that, and it can go in all kinds of different directions. Bon, en ce qui concerne président Macron et une visite en Élysée, bon, j'espère de parler avec lui dans les semaines qui viennent. Je voudrais bien visiter Paris et peut-être donner mon conférence de presse en français. Si les Français, comprennent mon français qui est un peu... disons, non, moi je parle comme une vache espagnole, donc mais ça marche.
Mais on continue en français, Radio 6, s'il vous plaît.
Oui. Donc pour la Radio Nationale Suisse, la première question, vous avez mentionné le sommet de paix qui va être organisé par la Suisse. Est-ce que vous pourriez nous en dire un petit peu plus sur ce que vous pensez de cet éventuel sommet et surtout ce que vous pensez d'un sommet qui, a priori, n'invitera pas toutes les parties au conflit, c'est-à-dire que la Russie ne sera pas invitée à ce conflit, à ce sommet. Voilà, est-ce qu'un sommet de paix sans l'ennemi, entre guillemets, est utile?
Est-ce que vous voulez que je réponde en anglais ou en français? parce que c'est quand même question importante, peut-être c'est mieux en anglais. So on the peace conference potentially organized by Switzerland and sponsored by Zelensky, and the question was, is it a meaningful conference if not all parties, in other words Russia, is not involved? I think it's a very meaningful conference, and of course Zelensky and the Swiss are trying to work around the concept of timing, when it is best to organize it. Is it in March or is it in April? That depends a little bit. I think there's a sentiment that Zelensky, and rightly so, wants to bring in a lot of countries from the global south. That's why he started this set of conferences in Jeddah, in Saudi Arabia a while back, and I think there's been one in Malta, and now there'll be a bigger one in Switzerland. I think the key there is to have countries like India, China, Saudi Arabia, Nigeria, South Africa, and Brazil involved. I think the quest for peace and the attempt for peace from Zelensky's part is sincere and real. I predict that he will not be pushing for his 10-point plan, but starting piecemeal with a few key issues, and I think that's a good way to start. And then at some stage, of course, we all hope that Russia will come to the table as well. But I would argue that that only happens with international pressure. And that international pressure has to come from somewhere else than the West, because we have clearly chosen our side in this conflict. We will support Ukraine for whatever it takes and continue to do that. So I think it's very good that Switzerland is hosting the conference, and then we'll see what the follow-up is.
Just one quick follow-up.
Okay.
So as the president-elect of a former neutral country.
We were neutral during the Cold War, so it's a long time ago.
Yeah, but not neutral anymore.
No.
Do you think that it is still relevant to have neutral countries on the European continent? Not the European Union, obviously, but is it still relevant?
Well, I can't, assess the relevance of neutrality, but one of the things I felt quite strongly about in the beginning of the war was pushing back on this notion that Finland had been a neutral country during the Cold War. No, we were not. In the early 1990s, we ditched neutrality, and we were neutral only because of necessity after the Peace of Stalin in 1944. And once the Cold War ended, and certainly after the Soviet Union was dismantled, we reverted to a definition which was something to the effect of a country that does not belong to a military alliance. But remember that we were politically allied in the European Union. We had a very close partnership with NATO. So I never saw us as neutral. Now, Sweden, on the other hand, was by definition neutral for pretty much 200 years. But we were not. Is there space for neutrality? I would say yes, and each and every country can choose their own sentiment. Some of them have defined it in their constitution, as I think is the case with for instance, Ireland. But when it comes to political neutrality in a conflict where Russia has violated virtually every tenet of international law, including territorial integrity, sovereignty and independence, I think it's very difficult to be neutral on that. And I think that's the message that we need to give to the global south as well. Basically what Russia is trying to do is to colonize Ukraine, to basically have Ukraine cease to exist as a country, and no one of us can stay neutral in that kind of a situation, because it breaks and violates UN charters and of course the OSCE as well.
Merci. Elina Kervinen, Helsingin Sanomat.
Kiitos kysymysvuorosta. Jatkaisin tästä Ukrainan asiasta. Ukrainasta kuuluu nyt huonoja uutisia, esimerkiksi vetäytyminen Arvikasta ja ammuspula ja monia muita asioita. Onko länsi epäonnistunut Ukrainan tukemisessa ja mikä tunnelma keskusteluissa esimerkiksi Zelenskin kanssa oli liittyen Yhdysvaltojen tukeen ja tähän tukitilanteeseen?
Niin, jos länsi olisi epäonnistunut tuessaan Ukrainalle, niin Ukraina ei enää olisi olemassa. Nyt täytyy muistaa, että lähtökohta Putinin hyökkäykselle oli se, että hän pystyy valtaamaan Kiovan 3 päivässä. Ja tässä me olemme kohta 2 vuotta myöhemmin ja ollaan tilanteessa, jossa Ukraina on edelleen itsenäinen valtio ja käynyt kovan taistelun muutaman aluemenetyksen myötä Venäjää vastaan. Zelenskin tulokulma oli oikeastaan aika samantyyppinen, mikä hänellä on ollut julkisuudessa, joka siis tarkoittaa sitä, että totta kai hän haluaa lisää rahaa. Siinähän me Suomena ja Eurooppana ja tietysti myös Yhdysvallat on ollut vahva tuki. Hän haluaa lisää ammuksia ja hän haluaa lisää aseita. Mutta itse lähtisin siitä, että tällä hetkellä on 3 kokonaisuutta, jotka ikään kuin sementoivat Ukrainan aseman eurooppalaisena ja läntisenä valtiona. Ensimmäinen niistä on turvallisuussopimukset, jotka siis lähtee G7-ehdotuksesta, jotka Ukraina on allekirjoittanut Britannian, Saksan kanssa ja kohta Ranskan, Italian ja Kanadan kanssa. Ja 31 maata on sitoutunut tähän samaan linjaan ja Pohjoismaat myös, itse asiassa yhteispohjoismaalaisessa kokous 13.12. Eli se on ikään kuin se ensimmäinen pala, mutta siitä puuttuu ehkä se kaikista tärkein, se on amerikkalaisten kanssa tehtävä turvallisuussopimus. Toinen ulottuvuus on EU-jäsenyys, joka nyt kähti minun mielestä hyvinkin eteenpäin joulukuussa ja sitten 3. on tietysti NATO-jäsenyys, mutta matka sinne on edelleen pitkä. Eli tilanne on tietenkin Ukrainan ja meidän kaikkien näkökulmasta vaikea ja sitähän se on ollut alusta saakka, mutta kyllä edelleen pidän niin kuin Euroopan ja Yhdysvaltain tukea keskeisenä senkin suhteen, että Ukraina saa lopullisen voiton.
Anna Karismo, Yle.
Kiitos kysymysvuorosta. Mikä oli täältä mielestänne Suomen turvallisuustilanteen ja politiikan näkökulmasta tärkein viesti? Ja toinen kysymys, kerroitte, että olette käynyt keskusteluja myös Euroopan turvallisuuspolitiikan kehittämisestä, niin mitä mieltä olette siitä, että esimerkiksi täällä Saksassa on noussut keskusteluun eurooppalainen ydinase, ja kuten tiedämme, Ranska on tarjonnut ydinasesuojaa myöskin Euroopalle, eli minkälaista keskustelua kävitte ydinasepolitiikasta?
Joo, Suomen kohdalla niin ehkä se perusviesti on sama, mikä meillä on ollut jo kauan. Eli meidän ulkopoliittinen linja pysyy samana, mitä se on ollut aikaisemmin. Ihmisoikeudet, perusoikeudet, demokratia, vapaus, oikeusvaltio, vähemmistöjen puolustaminen. Se linja on ikään kuin sama. Mutta turvallisuuspolitiikassa ja puolustuspolitiikassa meillä on uusi aikakausi, johtuen tietysti siitä, että olemme nyt sotilaallisesti liittoutunut maa ja Naton jäsen. Se perusviesti, minkä varmasti virallisesti puolustusministeri Antti Häkkänen täällä antoi ja minäkin epävirallisesti, oli se, että Suomi kyllä tekee tehtävänsä, joka tarkoittaa sitä, että nyt kun Naton raja Venäjän kanssa on tuplaantunut meidän jäsenyyden myötä, niin meidän kapasiteetti ylläpitää omaa puolustusta ja puolustaa omaa maatamme on vahvempi kuin koskaan. Me tulemme tekemään tarvittavan myös NATO-jäsenenä, eli me olemme turvallisuuden tuottaja, ei turvallisuuden kuluttaja. Ja tietysti aina kun näistä puhuu, niin sen jälkeen on hyvä kertoa, mitä se tarkoittaa luvuissa sekä maassa, merellä että ilmalla. Ja kyllä niin kuin luotto Suomeen NATO-maissa ja lännessä on hyvinkin vahva ja sitä viestiä pystyy epävirallisesti ja muutoin viemään eteenpäin. Tässä vaiheessa en halua ottaa kantaa kysymykseen eurooppalaisista ydinaseista monestakin syystä. Ensimmäinen on se, että meillä on aina kerrallaan yksi tasavallan presidentti ja hän on Sauli Niinistö 1.3. saakka. Ja nämä ovat sen mittaluokan asioita, että niiden linjaukset keskustellaan aivan varmasti TP-UTVassa ja sitten myös eduskunnan kanssa laajemmin. Ehkä sen voi sanoa, että ydinaseen pelotteen merkitys Euroopassakin on kasvanut, mutta ehkä se vahvin pelote tulee kuitenkin edelleen Yhdysvalloilta. Saksassa on huomattavasti vaikeampi keskustella turvallisuuspoliittisesta linjanmuutoksesta, koska se on ollut niin pitkällä ikään kuin saksalaisten selkärangassa. Sehän me ollaan nähty tässä Zeitenwendessä myös, kun taas meillä aika usein turvallisuuspoliittiset muutokset on liittyneet puhtaasti maailmanpoliittiseen tilanteeseen ja hyvinkin käytännönläheiseen tulokulmaan, mutta en halua tässä vaiheessa ottaa kantaa eurooppalaisiin ydinaseisiin.
Kiitos. Francis Farrell, Kiev Independent.
Hello from Ukraine and congratulations on the position. Ukraine looks with a lot of aspiration and admiration at the path taken by Finland. Can you tell me, in your opinion, is Ukraine's place in NATO as a full member? And if so, if it was up to you, what would the circumstances be in which it could join? Thank you.
Sure. Again, I'll only speak in my personal capacity because, as I stressed in the beginning, I'm only president-elect and I won't be inaugurated until the 1st of March. I think in the big picture we have to look at what Putin tried to achieve. He tried to Russify Ukraine. He failed. He tried to split Europe. He failed. He tried to split NATO. He failed. He tried to split transatlantic partnership. He failed. And of course the icing on the cake was that he has brought NATO closer to his border, exactly the opposite of what he tried to do. One thing is for sure, Europe is fairly permanently split. The new Iron Curtain is drawn between Russia, Belarus on one side, and the rest of Europe on the other side. As far as Ukraine's European and transatlantic aspirations are concerned, I see them going through 3 steps. The first step being the security arrangements that are being now signed by all G7 countries and 31 countries that have signed up to the same. Us Nordics have announced that we will do the same. We did that, I think, on the 13th of December in a Nordic meeting, and I see no reason to change tack on that. The second step is EU membership, which we quite often see as soft power, but it's actually hard power, because you become a part of a bigger union that is there to protect you and actually functions as a protector. And then the final step is NATO membership. So I think in the long run, NATO membership for Ukraine is what we should strive for. And I'm sure that we'll see language in that direction as we start moving towards the Washington summit in July. So step by step, but I think the direction is quite clear. It's just a question of timing.
So, Silvia Stöber, ARD, bitte schön.
In 2008, during the war in Georgia, as a foreign minister, you were involved in the negotiations. Given this special experience, what do you say about negotiations with Russia? When and how should they be conducted?
I think the case is very different. So basically we've had, 3 aggressions coming from Russia. The first one was in August 2008, the second one, I think February 2014 with the Crimean Peninsula, and then of course the third one in February 2022 with the full onslaught. And in many ways, one thing led to another, and I think we in the West have learned our lesson. So Putin thought that he could do the same thing that he did in Georgia. He thought he could do the same thing that he did with the Crimean Peninsula when he went for the full-on attack on Ukraine. What did we learn? I think we need to separate 2 things. One, the war in Georgia was minor for Putin. So when Bernard Kouchner and I flew first to Tbilisi and then I flew to prepare the final negotiations to Moscow, it was quite clear that both sides wanted an immediate ceasefire. And we achieved that in 5 days with, if I recall correctly, 5 fairly classical points that ceasefire agreements create. But we did end up creating 2 frozen conflicts, South Ossetia and Abkhazia. And of course now no one is talking about a frozen conflict because this is a full-on war. The separate and second point here is that this war is too big for Putin to fail. And that's what makes it quite problematic. I've always said, and I'll continue to say, that the only thing that Putin understands is power. You show any weakness, any soft elements, and he will attack. So I think once we start moving towards some kind of peace negotiations, we need to understand that you have to be tough with Russia, and especially with Putin, because of course, Russia has signed X amount of agreements with Ukraine, including the borders of 1991, did not respect it, including another agreement in 1994, didn't respect it. Including, of course, charters of the UN and the OSCE, did not respect it. So, whatever solution is found, at the end of the day, it's going to have to be a hard border. And that's what makes things a little bit complicated. I personally hope that China would get involved, because they now are in the driver's seat with the relationship with Russia. The problem that we have with peace mediation right now is that it's become too transactional, and you have a lot of middle powers doing it, and then it doesn't stick. When the UN does it, it usually sticks. I mean, you might have an opinion of the Dayton Accords in Bosnia, but there was a UN representative doing it, and there was peace. You might have an opinion on how we did Georgia, but it stuck. The Minsk agreements didn't stick. So, I'd like to see more involvement from big multilateral institutions, but of course a lot of the stuff has to take place under the radar at the moment. And that's why it's not going to be something that's discussed in the public. Eventually peace will prevail, but none of us know when that will take place.
So, Polish television, please.
Dear President, you was taking part in the discussions, many informal discussions during this Munich conference. What is your general opinion? What is the general opinion of the participants about the way how help Ukraine, how make Ukraine to win this war? What is the general belief of the all political leaders, how this war should be won, but by what means, what should be done to win this war? And the second question concerns Belarus. You said that Belarus in the one block with Russia, it's really it's true for the Lukashenko regime, but we very often forget that 8 million of people deeply dislike this regime and are oppressed. So 25 people daily are arrested in Belarus, and yesterday they announced that they arrested, I believe, 4 saboteurs working for Ukraine. So it's really harsh, the harshest repression since Stalin's time in Belarus, and people do not really like Lukashenko regime. So are you for leaving those people behind the Iron Curtain, and how do you comment what is going on in physical terms, because people are getting less and less visas, so the contacts with the free world are getting more and more difficult. 11 editorial offices of independent media which are working abroad because they cannot work from Belarus, so now are at the brink of being closed. So what will be the strategy toward the society of Belarus? So first, what is the general opinion, how Ukraine?
Dziękuję bardzo.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, so I think the recipe for an overall victory for Ukraine remains the same. There needs to be steadfast support from the West, so the US and Europe. And the elements that we're talking about are quite simple and straightforward. One is financial, and I think there Europe is delivering. The US hopefully continues to deliver. The second one is military linked to ammunition. There I think we're right now having challenges. And there are many reasons for that. One is that the production of ammunition was ramped down during the Cold War, when we got a little bit too idealistic that we live in eternal peace, or in a world where aggression on European borders doesn't take place. The Americans can provide that, and hopefully they'll continue to do their deliveries. We Europeans have to do something. One of the things I talked about in the campaign was, I know it's not a short-term solution, but I think the bank that I used to work for, the European Investment Bank, should change its statute. In other words, allowing financing and loans to defense industries, because you need to start lumping big orders together. The defense industry always works long term with long-term projects, and I think Ursula von der Leyen has been talking about how Europe is going to better structure that, and she's going to put out a policy paper, and I think this hopefully works in the long term. The third element, which I still think is one of the strongest deterrents, are the security arrangements and agreements which are bilateral, coming from the UK, Germany, other G7 countries. I think that sends a clear message to Putin that he will lose this war. And of course then adding on to that the deterrence of EU membership, which is on track now. And then of course the wording, because language matters, that we get in the Washington summit. So those are the key elements. On Belarus, if you don't mind, I wouldn't like to express my opinion right now because I haven't been briefed well enough. I just remember from the time that I was chairman of the OSCE in 2008 and visited Minsk a couple of times. Very similar issues that have to do with press freedom, civil society, opposition, and at that time I met not only Lukashenko but and his government, but also representatives from civil society and the media. Of course, we should not leave Belarus alone. The reality is that for as long as Lukashenko is in power, it's impossible to deal with Belarus. But if there is a regime change, then things will probably change.
Okay, then we have a Czech magazine. Please present yourself.
Good morning, Tomas Lindner, Respect Weekly. Basically, I have interconnected questions to the topic of Europeans, so our preparation for a possible Trump presidency. First part is, what contacts do we, as Europeans, have at this moment into the inner circle of Trump, or towards people that are really close to him? The second point is, if we imagine a scenario that in the year 2025, Americans will stop aiding Ukraine with ammunition, other things, for different reasons connected to Trump, how ready are we, how capable are we as Europeans in such a situation to defend or help defend Ukraine? And the third part is, what realistically can we still do in the coming months to prepare for this presidency? Thank you.
Okay, I mean, obviously we're talking about a hypothetical here in the sense that, we don't know whether the next president of the United States is Joe Biden or a Joe Biden-like president or Donald Trump or a Donald Trump-like president. I can only speak, obviously, for myself as president-elect and say that the Finnish president will have to and will get along with the President of the United States, regardless of who it is. I also feel that we're a very close ally to the US right now because we are NATO members and because we just signed a defense cooperation agreement with the United States. I look at the difference in the electoral rhetoric in the US and in Finland. It is quite remarkable, I must admit. I'm an avid student of the US and I've studied there, did my undergraduate work there, and have been following American elections actually ever since Bill Clinton was elected. I would probably at this stage call for all of us to be cool, calm and collected and understand that there are only a few things that you can affect, and that is your own preparedness. We cannot affect the American elections. I don't have the right to vote there. I assume you don't have the right to vote there as well. So that means that we have to prepare for different types of scenarios. I personally think that it's highly unlikely that the United States, no matter who is elected, would stop supporting Ukraine. And the reason is very simple. The transactional cost of that is too high. It doesn't matter who is president, he or she will understand that supporting Ukraine in this point in time is crucial for American security interests. And also, all of this talk about the US withdrawing from Europe, I don't believe in that, because the US wants to be a superpower. Yes, it is pivoting towards the Pacific, and yes, it is pivoting towards China. But were it to abandon Europe, it would lessen its superpower status radically. For those same reasons, I don't see the US withdrawing from the Middle East. So again, take a very Finnish line on this. Cool, calm and collected, and then you deal with whatever comes.
Jonny Sjöblom, Svenska Yle, varsågod.
Ni träffade president Zelensky igår. Vilka former av fortsatt finländskt stöd för Ukraina talade ni om och med vilken tidtabell tänker ni åka till Kiev?
Jag är ju så att säga bara blivande president, så det var numera för mig att lyssna på vad president Zelensky ville framföra, och som sagt så diskuterar vi flera olika frågor. Det är självklart att Finland kommer att fortsätta sitt stöd för Ukraina, och han var ju då mycket tacksam för det stöd som de två regeringar vi har haft har redan gett. Vi talar om den här så kallade fredskonferensen som kommer att äga rum i Schweiz. Han frågade väl mera på den linjen att skulle vi kunna hjälpa få den globala södern med, för att det är självklart att alla vi europeiska och västländska länder kommer med, men han bad om hjälp i de här frågorna. Sen bjöd han undertecknad på besök till Kiev. Det här var ett första möte som vi hade. Jag var mycket imponerad av det som han hade att säga. Jag var mycket imponerad om hur bra han har koll över situationen, och jag ville bara ge det budskapet som kommer från regeringen och sittande presidenten, att Finland kommer att fortsätta sitt stöd för Ukraina. Och det finns ju många orsaker till det här. Det är inte bara vårt intresse, men vi har ett ganska starkt identiskt band, tycker jag, till Ukraina på grund av att vi har haft en liknande erfarenhet i både vinterkriget och fortsättningskriget, och ukrainarna förstår det här.
Tack så mycket. Anna-Liina Kauhanen, Helsingin Sanomat.
Kiitos. Kun seuraa Münchenin turvallisuuskonferenssin keskusteluja, saa vaikutelman hyvin pessimistisesta tilanteesta, jossa umpikujia on vastassa Ukrainan tuessa, transatlanttisessa suhteessa, Lähi-idässä, Kiinasuhteessa. Miten kuvaatte sitä geopoliittista tilannetta, jossa aloitatte presidenttiin?
Meillä taisi olla tämä sama keskustelu viime vuonna suunnilleen tähän aikaan, joskin taustakeskusteluna. Eli lähtisin ehkä liikkeelle siitä, että maailmanhistoriassa on aina sellaisia hetkiä, jolloin kansainvälisessä politiikassa tapahtuu suurempi murros tai muutos. Ensimmäisen maailmansodan jälkeen perustettiin kansainliitto, joka sitten oli tavoitteeltaan hyvä, mutta tehtäviltään epäonnistui. Toisen maailmansodan jälkeen perustettiin YK, joka oli sekä tavoitteeltaan hyvä että onnistui koteloimaan kylmän sodan ja välttämään kolmannen maailmansodan. Sitten siinä taisi käydä kylmän sodan jälkeen 89-91 niin, että me jollain tavalla oletimme liikaa, eli oletimme, että kaikki maailman 200 kansallisvaltiota siirtyy kohti jonkinnäköistä yhteiskuntamallia, jossa on pilarina liberaalidemokratia, sosiaalinen markkinatalous ja globalisaatio. Mutta se ikään kuin polku lähti sivuraiteille, ehkä sieltä 9/11, mutta jollain tavalla kaikista radikaaleimmin 24.2.2022. Millainen maailma meillä tällä hetkellä on? Me elämme epäjärjestyksen maailmassa, rauhattomuuden maailmassa, jossa niitä kansainvälisiä sääntöjä, kansainvälisiä instituutioita, joihin me olemme tukeutuneet toisen maailmansodan jälkeen, mutta myös kylmän sodan aikana, niin niitä haastetaan. Niitä haastetaan idästä, Kiina, Venäjä, Iran. Niitä kyseenalaistetaan globaalista etelästä, koska heidän tulokulmansa on se, että ne instituutiot, jotka on rakennettu kansainvälistä järjestelmää valvomaan, niin ne suosivat länsimaita ja ne ovat länsimaiden rakentamia. He ovat osittain tässä oikeassa. Itse luulen, että tulemme näkemään enenevässä määrin epäpyhiä alliansseja ja kahdenvälisiä tai kolmenvälisiä alliansseja, jotka tehdään vähän tällaisesta niin kuin reaalipoliittisesta näkökulmasta, vähän tällainen à la carte maailma. Ja Suomellehan tämä tarkoittaa tietysti sitä, että yhtäältä me tukeudumme meidän vahvoihin kansainvälisiin instituutioihin, kuten Euroopan unioniin, NATOon, YK:hon ja myös Etyihin, semminkin kun se jatkaa toimintaansa. Mutta sitten samalla rakennamme vahvoja kahdenvälisiä suhteita tietysti meidän läheisten liittolaisten kanssa Pohjoismaissa ja Euroopassa, mutta myös Yhdysvaltojen kanssa ja myös globaalin etelän kanssa. Eli kyllä me olemme aika vaikeassa maailmanpoliittisessa tilanteessa tällä hetkellä, mutta onneksi meillä Suomessa kuitenkin on kapasiteetti käsitellä vaikeita tilanteita ja löytää ratkaisuja. Meillä on aika vahva konsensus ja sitten meidän turvallisuustilanne on siinäkin mielessä hyvä, että meillä on ne 3 lukkoa, joista on paljon puhunut. Eli meidän oma uskottava puolustus osana liittokuntaa, meidän NATO- ja EU-jäsenyydet ja sitten meidän DCA-sopimus Yhdysvaltojen kanssa. Mutta vähän tällaiseen tietysti epävarmaan aikakauteen Suomen tasavallan 13 presidentti astuu, siitä ei pääse yli eikä ympäri, mutta yleensä nämä asiat hoituu rauhassa ja maltilla.
Kiitos. Janne Puumalainen, MTV.
Kiitos. Oikeastaan 2 kysymystä. Kysyisin ensinnäkin, Zelenski eilen puhui keinotekoisesta asevajeesta, joka vaivaa Ukrainaa, ja itse tulkitsen sanakin kritiikkinä länsimaiden aseavun tahtia ja laatua kohtaan, että Ukraina ei saa turhaan jarrutella ja siksi Ukraina kärsii nyt Venäjän ylivoimasta tällä hetkellä. Ja toisena kysymyksenä sanoitte alkuun Aleksei Navalnista, että Venäjä pitää saada vastuuseen tästä asiasta, niin mitä se ihan käytännössä tarkoittaa?
Joo, kiitos. Keinotekoisella asevajeella varmasti Zelenski tarkoitti nimenomaan sitä, että hän tarvitsee enenevässä määrin tukia länneltä, sekä Yhdysvalloilta että Euroopalta. Nämähän on aika pitkälti kahdenvälisiä kysymyksiä ja eilisessä tapaamisessa tietysti sanomattakin on selvää, että Suomelle esitettiin erilaisia pyyntöjä, samantyyppisiä mitä on esitetty nykyiselle hallitukselle ja presidentille, ja varmasti tulen itse sitten virkaan astujaisten jälkeen katsomaan, että mitä tämä tarkoittaa, mutta näistä suuret päätökset tehdään tietysti TP-UTVassa ja sitten puolustusministeriön ja puolustusministerin toimesta. Hätä on suuri Ukrainassa tällä hetkellä, ja se johtuu siitä, että he ovat asemasodassa. Jos jotain positiivista hakee, niin hyökkääminen on huomattavasti vaikeampaa kuin puolustaminen, mutta välillä myös puolustaminen, kuten me ollaan tänään nähty joukkojen vetäytymisen myötä, niin on vaikeaa, ja Ukraina tarvitsee kaiken sen tuen länneltä, jonka se voi saada. Navalnin kohdalta niin vaikea sanoa, mitä käytännössä Venäjän vastuuseen asettaminen tarkoittaa. Niin kuin ollaan aikaisemmin puhuttu, tai aikaisemmin nostettu esille, niin sanomattakin on selvää, että Venäjä pitää asettaa vastuuseen tämän sodan aloittamista ja niistä sotarikoksista, joita se on tässä matkan varrella tehnyt. Ja tietysti maailma on menettänyt yhden suuren demokratian ja vapauden puolustajan Navalnin muodossa. Muodostuuko tässä sitten jonkinnäköinen symbolinen käännekohta muualta, niin hirveän vaikea sanoa. Nyt mä oon nähnyt vain nämä alustavat reaktiot.
Kiitos. Thank you so much. We are running out of time and running out of space as well, because the next one is coming here. So thank you so much, Professor Stubb, for giving this briefing.